org. The U.S. House is gaveling in next, coming back to begin work on the first of three parts of the surface transportation bill, today dealing with offshore oil and gas drilling as well as the drilling in Alaska and the Keystone XL pipeline. Live coverage of the House now here on C-SPAN.
The House will be in order. The prayer will be offered by our guest chaplain today, Reverend Rudy Stevens, United States Army, Pinehurst, North Carolina.
Lord, too often we Americans back home forget to pray for our leaders here in D.C. Forgive us, Lord. For those assembled here in the People's House, I pray that you give them courage, strength, and wisdom. Give them courage from our convictions, strength from your Spirit, and wisdom for decisions. Decisions here are choices that shape circumstances of years, if not generations, for all Americans. All the way from California to North Carolina, that airborne chorus sounds off loud and strong. This land is my land, and this land is your land. And it's here in this room that chorus hits the ground and finds harmony, reminding us that from many we are one nation under God that seeks liberty and justice for all the fatherless and the oppressed. So, Lord, hear our prayer and keep these leaders wise, strong, and courageous. In Jesus' name, amen.
The Chair has examined the Journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the Journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance today will be led by the gentlelady from California, Ms. Hahn.
Thank you. Please join with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Without objection, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Coble, is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a great honor for me today to introduce Army Chaplain Rudy Stevens. Captain Stevens lives in North Carolina's 6th Congressional District and serves the 2504 Parachute Infantry Regiment, 1st Brigade Combat Team of the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. During his tenure, Mr. Speaker, Captain Stevens has received many awards, most notably the Bronze Star, the Air Assault Wings, and Jump Wings. He has been deployed, Mr. Speaker, on several separate occasions and will continue his duty with a deployment to Afghanistan in the coming months. On behalf of the constituents of the 6th District of North Carolina and my colleagues here in the People's House, Chaplain Stevens, we welcome you to the House of Representatives and extend our appreciation to you for having offered today's prayer. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The Chair will entertain up to 15 further requests for 1-minute speeches from both sides of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota rise? And the gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to offer my respects for retired Colonel John R. Head of the United States Air Force. Colonel Head was born as Swedish immigrants in St. Paul, Minnesota on August 16, 1920, and ever since he was young, his passion was aviation. In his teens, he enlisted in the Air National Guard and eventually went on to flying school in the Army Air Corps. He later served in World War II in the Aleutian Islands. Upon his return to Minnesota, he helped start the Air National Guard base in Duluth, now the 148th Fighter Wing. In his career, he flew over 7,400 hours in over 75 different aircraft. He even owned a prototype of the Baby Albatross sailplane, which now resides at the Smithsonian. And in 2003, he was inducted to the Minnesota Aviation Hall of Fame. He was a devoted husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, and he was married to the love of his life, Artel, for 55 years. Throughout his 91 years on Earth, Colonel Head was a true American who lived by the motto of God, family, country. Minnesota will miss him, and America will miss the likes of him. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise? Does the gentleman seek unanimous consent?
Yes.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to ask my colleagues to support a tax cut to help entrepreneurs start businesses. Today I'm introducing the Help Entrepreneurs Create American Jobs Act to permanently double the deduction for startup expenses. Supporting small entrepreneurs who are the true job creators and creating jobs should be our #1 priority. That is why President Obama called for this tax cut and why I am proud to stand with businesses across my district and the nation to introduce this common sense proposal. We must put party aside and make it easier for Americans to start small businesses. I ask my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina rise?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, National Review editor Rich Lowry stated that the President's budget, quote, is built on gimmicks and cheery assumptions that support a massive superstructure of new taxes and new debt. It is a blueprint for national decline, end of quote. The President's budget request called for the biggest tax increases and accumulates the largest debt in our nation's history. Over the past 3 years, this administration has spent more money than ever before and increased our national debt by almost $5 trillion. Our unemployment rate has consistently remained above 8% for 36 months. It is clear that borrowing and spending more money will not create jobs. It is past time for the President and the liberal-controlled Senate to come together and support House Republican efforts to put American families back to work. Dozens of job-promoting bills have passed the House, sadly held up in the Senate graveyard. In conclusion, God bless our troops, and we will never forget September 11th and the global war on terrorism.
Gentleman from California rise. The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, across the nation, Americans are calling on Congress to take immediate action to create new jobs, and I state to create new jobs. Instead of working on a bipartisan agenda to create jobs, Republicans are moving on a transportation bill that slashes the infrastructure funding and destroys jobs. I say destroys jobs. Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood has called this bill the worst transportation bill he has ever seen. The Republican transportation bill would eliminate, I state, would eliminate 550,000 American jobs. That's American jobs. Cut highway investment in 45 states and bankrupt the Highway Trust Fund by $98 billion. Congress must get serious about working together to solve the problems our nation is facing. It just can't be my way or the highway. Let's do a jobs bill that will create jobs for the American people. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise? The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I proudly rise today to congratulate Archbishop Timothy Dolan, who will be elevated to a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church this Saturday. His Holiness Pope Benedict could not have picked a better man of faith for this prestigious role. Archbishop Dolan has dedicated his entire life to serving God and the Catholic Church. Just 3 years ago, New Yorkers were blessed when the Pope appointed him the 10th Archbishop of New York. He has warmed our hearts with his big personality and quick wit, and he has strengthened our faith with his guidance. On a national level, his leadership has shed positive light on the Catholic Church and continues to raise its profile. As New Yorkers, we are truly blessed to have Archbishop Dolan lead our archdiocese from the pulpit at St. Patrick's Cathedral. We couldn't be more proud that he will soon be wearing a red hat and serving as the Prince of Catholic Church in Pope's College of Cardinals. And once again, I offer my warm congratulations to the Cardinal Designate Dolan and wish him Godspeed in his new role. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise? The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday, President Obama released his 2013 budget proposal. The budget recognizes that infrastructure investments are necessary to create an environment of growth. For Western New York in particular, we are pleased it includes measures to benefit the Niagara Falls Air Reserve Station, the Buffalo Coast Guard, Jamestown Airport, and our Great Lakes. We need only look at the United States in 1937, Japan in the 1990s, and Europe over the last couple of years to understand the dire consequences of government pulling back at a time of economic uncertainty. For this reason, I wish the budget had gone a little further. The New America Foundation report makes the case that investing $1.2 trillion over the next 5 years rebuilding the infrastructure of this nation will create 27 million jobs in 5 years. This job growth would cut the debt and deficit and create jobs for Americans, for these jobs cannot be outsourced. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, despite the Obama administration's recent action to disguise their attempt to force contraceptive coverage on religious institutions, the American people will not be fooled. The Obama administration has gone out of its way to impose its radical agenda on Americans. While some religious exemptions exist for churches, affiliated institutions such as religious hospitals or schools would not be exempt from this overreaching mandate. In fact, New York Bishop Timothy Dolan summed it up when he said, quote, "Never before has the federal government forced individuals and organizations to go out into the marketplace and buy a product that violates their own conscience. This shouldn't happen in a land where free exercise of religion ranks first in the Bill of Rights. This administration has shown no restraint in expanding the size, scope, and power of the federal government. We must repeal this law and restore religious freedom to religiously affiliated institutions in this country."
Purposes the gentlelady from California rise. And the gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to speak about our college tuition crisis. It's a topic of conversation that comes up around kitchen tables all across America. Parents are seeing college tuition creep up year after year while their income has declined or stagnated and their savings have been squeezed. Parents are worried that their children won't get a shot at the American dream because they simply cannot afford the cost of higher education. The President's budget proposal makes it clear that even in these tough budgetary times, we cannot shirk our responsibilities to strengthen investments in education. I share his commitment to increasing college affordability and quality. Freezing interest rates on subsidized student loans is something we can do something about right now to help millions of students across the country. Failure to act means that 7 million students could see their interest rates double to 6.8%. I urge my colleagues to work with the President to make sure that this issue gets the time and attention that it deserves. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
And the gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to commend the coordinated approach to Child Health Initiative, the CATCH Act, an innovative program being implemented in Houston and across Texas to combat rising rates of childhood obesity. It's no secret that childhood obesity is a growing problem in our country. Statistics show that 18% of elementary school children are overweight, and the number is growing every year. The University of Texas School of Public Health created CATCH to help elementary schools, children and their families adopt healthy eating and physical activity behaviors. CATCH is a huge success. It's been adopted by more than 2,500 elementary schools in Texas, impacting 800,000 school children. That's 50% of Texas elementary schools. CATCH has received national recognition for being one of the most comprehensive and cost-effective approaches in fighting childhood obesity. Madam Speaker, I commend all the schools in Texas that have adopted this program. They recognize that every child needs to be taught, and every child needs to be taught to grow up healthy. I thank the Speaker. Yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina rise? And the gentleman is recognized.
Today, family and friends will gather to celebrate the 100th birthday of Lottie Harris Rollins Dunston, a wonderful human being who has lived in Wake County, North Carolina her entire life. Grand Lottie, as she is affectionately called, is the second eldest of 13 siblings, 7 of whom are still living and advanced in age. After working her way through historic Fayetteville State College, she went on to become an elementary teacher where she shaped young minds for 41 long years. Today, Grand Lottie is a lover of Shakespeare and politics and, most of all, cherishes her independence. So often she can be seen driving her white pickup truck as she shops for her needs with her 5-year-old chocolate lab, Diva. Madam Speaker, Grand Lottie loves her supportive family that includes granddaughter Jacqueline Rollins Wins, whose husband serves on the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. We pray that Grand Lottie continues to enjoy health and happiness for many more years. Happy birthday to you, and most of all, thank you for making North Carolina a better place to live and work. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back.
For what purposes the gentleman from Texas rise? And the gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, when the presidents passed the unconstitutional government takeover of health care, they cleverly front-loaded some of the provisions, but left the most troubling mandates and requirements to be implemented at a later date. Recently, the Obama administration released its controversial contraception mandate, and Americans got a glimpse of the looming disaster that the health care law will produce once it actually goes fully into effect. This mandate is one of the first prescribed by the Democrats' government health care takeover, but it will not be the last. Unfortunately, the HHS ruling that ignores religious freedom is just one example of the many disastrous provisions of a top-down, government-controlled health care system. If Americans did not like this provision, they certainly won't like the IPAB, the Independent Payment Advisory Board, a group of 15 unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats will control virtually every health care decision. I urge my colleagues to support common-sense legislation that will protect the rights of all human life, including the unborn, and to continue working to fully repeal the Democrats' government health care takeover as a whole, as well as the harmful individual provisions that violate our constitutional rights. Thank you. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from California rise? The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I've come to this floor practically every week for the past few months asking my friends on both sides of the aisle to work together to extend the payroll tax cut and the unemployment benefits for a full year. As we convene this today, it looks like we may have a deal. And to be sure that we follow through, let's remind ourselves what this would mean for Americans. Working families would see more than $80 a month in their pockets, almost $1,000 for the year. It's always good for people to be able to keep more of their money in their own pockets. And 2.8 million Americans and nearly 500,000 Californians, where I come from, would be able to keep their unemployment benefits for their lifeline during these tough times. And the Doc Fix would allow seniors on Medicare to continue to see their own doctors. I know the ink isn't dry, but I believe this is the type of compromise and governing that our constituents and all of America wants to see us do here in Congress. I want to encourage the leaderships on both sides of the aisle to get this deal done, move forward, and create jobs in this great country. Thank you. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise? The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, there's nothing more important to democracy than sunshine. This March, among the most historic and momentous cases ever to come before the Supreme Court, will be health care. Many Americans supported health care reform, many opposed it. It was the product of hundreds of hours of debate on this very floor and in committees over many months. And while there's a limited number of seats for the public here in the House, thanks to C-SPAN, millions of Americans had the opportunity to view those proceedings. Unfortunately, when the case comes before the Supreme Court, just 50 Americans will be able to witness it. Shouldn't transparency require that the average citizen have an opportunity to view those proceedings? There is an easy and non-intrusive way allowing cameras in the Supreme Court. Along with my colleague, Republican colleague, Judge Poe, I introduced H.R. 3572, the Cameras in the Courtroom Act, to require televising open Supreme Court proceedings. Sunshine remains the best disinfectant against those who might feel that the black robe of life tenure grants an entire branch of government permanent immunity from accountability. I urge my colleagues to support this thoughtful act, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota rise?
Madam Speaker, address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Does the gentleman seek unanimous consent?
Yes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Last week, this House did something that should be common but is getting rarer and rarer. We passed a bipartisan piece of legislation with a vote of 417 to 2. That was the Stock Act, the Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge bill, making sure that we have the audacity to say members of Congress should play by the same rules as everyone else, restoring faith in our markets. The Senate did the same thing, 96 to 3. But I remind you of those famous words from Saturday morning cartoons in Schoolhouse Rock, "I'm just a bill setting on Capitol Hill." It's not the law. There's no conference been decided yet, and the President, while in the State of the Union from that very perch, said he would sign that bill the very next day. There's nothing on the horizon bringing it up. Madam Speaker, I encourage my colleagues and I encourage all Americans to make sure they hold us accountable. Casting that vote for a bill still keeps it a bill. We need to follow through and make it the law of the land. With that, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Tennessee rise? Does the gentlelady seek unanimous consent?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Gentlelady is recognized.
In the wake of the Obama budget that has been filed this week and has been called everything from a nervous breakdown on paper to a disaster to not a serious budget, we get more news this morning. And according to a Gallup poll that has come out this morning, 85% of small business owners in this country indicated that they are currently not looking for workers. And asked why, 48% said it was due to concerns about possible rising health care costs. 46% said that they were worried about new government regulations because last year this administration gave them about 4,000 new mandates and gave them about 80,000 pages of new federal regulation. We need to return to the time-tested formula that always works in this country. Less regulation plus less taxation plus less litigation always equals more innovation and more job creation right here in this country. We know that the total cost of federal regulation has risen to $1.75 trillion annually, twice what is collected in federal income taxes. Let's get on the right track. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from America Samoa rise?
Address the House for 1 minute to extend and revise my remarks.
And the gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, this week President Obama revealed his FY 2013 proposed budget, which introduces important tax reforms to revitalize the economy by boosting job creation and encouraging businesses to bring overseas jobs back to America. President Obama's proposed budget especially underscores his commitment to provide needed tax relief for America's small businesses. For example, the proposed budget offers a temporary 10% tax credit for small businesses that add new jobs and raise workers' salaries. Madam Speaker, the proposed budget also offers tax incentives for locating jobs in the United States while eliminating tax deductions for shipping jobs overseas and closing tax loopholes that results in outsourcing U.S. jobs to foreign countries. Madam Speaker, in line with focusing the American manufacturing, President Obama also introduced temporary tax credits to directly some $20 billion in domestic clean energy manufacturing. Mr. Speaker, I commend President Obama for introducing significant reforms that will put America back to work, return profits to America's private sector, and promote stronger American economy. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee rise? Does the gentleman seek unanimous consent?
I so do.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This is Black History Month, and I introduced recently a proposal to have a congressional gold medal issued to a cumulative group, the individuals that marched for freedom, sat in, brought about civil rights in our nation, all the civil rights leaders and workers. You know, in this nation, to make it the country that Thomas Jefferson and our founding fathers wrote about, it took civil rights workers to protest and demonstrate and sometimes go to jail to change this country's path and see to it that all people were created equal and that all people had equal opportunities and in this nation. And I think those people deserve recognition because they made America's promise its reality. To date, we've sent out a letter asking for co-sponsors 3 times to every member of Congress, and yet we don't have a single Republican with us. This should be a bipartisan effort, and I would ask all my Republican colleagues to ask their LAs to sign on to the Congressional Gold Medal for Civil Rights Workers. It's something we should come together with in a bipartisan fashion because it's American as apple pie. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky rise?
Request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend.
And the gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, there is no question that our economy is recovering. The private sector has added jobs for 23 straight months, putting 3.7 million Americans workers back on the job. Last week in my district, GE opened its first new manufacturing facility and the first new product line at Louisville's Appliance Park in more than 50 years. Because of our Recovery Act investments, 1,300 workers will be back on the job at Appliance Park, and hundreds of those jobs are coming back from China. When the private sector can rely on the federal government as a partner, jobs and economic growth follow. And that's exactly what we're seeing today in my district and across the country. We decided we are not going to surrender the lead in innovation to the Chinese and the rest of the world. And as a result, we are revitalizing American manufacturing. We are making it in America. But we can't stop now. Madam Speaker, as we begin to debate the federal budget, we must continue to invest in American innovation and ingenuity, the way we have in Louisville and in so many other cities across the country. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
To revise and extend my remarks.
Does the gentleman seek unanimous consent?
I do.
He's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Speaker, the House leadership is still scrambling to find the votes to pass what everyone is coming to recognize is the worst transportation authorization bill in this nation's history. But with gasoline prices approaching $4 a gallon, House Republicans are falling back on their wrong-headed 2008 campaign slogan of drill, baby, drill. It's a cynical ploy and assumes Americans think that the pain of high gasoline prices is justifiable grounds to open restricted areas for drilling and weaken protections that would ensure offshore drilling is done in a safe and environmentally responsible manner. The cold reality, however, is that this bill will not bring relief to Americans suffering at the gasoline pump. And prosperous fishing and tourism industries, real job creators based in Bristol Bay, Southern California, the west coast of Florida, and Virginia will needlessly be placed at risk. And for what? Approximately $1.8 billion in new federal revenue over 10 years. Not nearly enough to fund public transit or any other meaningful part of a transportation infrastructure bill. And the revenue generated by drilling off Virginia's coast, $40 million over 10 years. Our governor says that's what's going to pay for his transportation plan, pays for nothing. Billions in economic activities and tens of thousands of jobs would be put at risk for very little in benefits. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 547 and ask for its immediate consideration.
And the clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 112, House Resolution 547. Resolved, that at any time after the adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 18, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the bill, H.R. 3408, to set clear rules for the development of United States oil shale resources, to promote shale technology and research and development, and for other purposes. The first reading of the bill shall be dispensed with. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, with 40 minutes equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources, and 20 minutes equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce. After general debate, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. In lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Natural Resources now printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Titles 14 and 17 of Rules Committee Print 112-14 shall be considered as adopted in the House and in the Committee of the Whole. The bill, as amended, shall be considered as the original bill for the purpose of further amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the bill as amended are waived. No further amendment to the bill as amended shall be in order except those printed in Part A of the Committee of the in Part A of the report of the Committee on Rules accompanying this resolution. Each such further amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question in the House or in the Committee of the Whole. All points of order against such further amendments are waived. At the conclusion of consideration of the bill for amendment, the committee shall rise and report the bill, as amended, to the House with such further amendments as may have been adopted. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill, as amended, and any further amendment thereto to final passage without intervening motion, except one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2. At any time after the adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 18, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the bill, H.R. 3813, to amend Title V, United States Code, to secure the annuities of federal civilian employees, and for other purposes. The first reading of the bill shall be dispensed with. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. After general debate, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. In lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform now printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Title 16 of Rules Committee Print 112-14 shall be considered as adopted in the House and in the Committee of the Whole. The bill as amended shall be considered as the original bill for the purpose of further amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the bill as amended are waived. No further amendment to the bill as amended shall be in order except those printed in Part B of the report of the Committee on Rules accompanying this resolution. Each such further amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question in the House or in the Committee of the Whole. All points of order against such further amendments are waived. At the conclusion of consideration of the bill for amendment, the committee shall rise and report the bill as amended to the House with such further amendments as may have been adopted. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill as amended, and any further amendment thereto to final passage without intervening motion except one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 3. At any time after the adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 18, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the bill, H.R. 7, to authorize funds for federal aid highway, public transportation, and highway and motor carrier safety programs, and for other purposes. The first reading of the bill shall be dispensed with. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. in lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure now printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Titles 1 through 13 and Title 15 of Rules Committee Print 112-14 shall be considered as adopted in the House and in the Committee of the Whole. General debate shall be confined to the bill as amended and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the Chair and Ranking Minority Member of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. After general debate, the Committee of the Whole shall rise without motion. No further consideration of the bill shall be in order except pursuant to a subsequent order of the House. Section 4. And preparing an amendment in the nature of a substitute to be adopted pursuant to this resolution, the clerk shall retain the title and section designations as they appear in Rules Committee Print 112-14. Section 5, and the engrossment of a measure addressed by the first or second section of this resolution, the clerk is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to amendatory instructions. Section 6A, in the engrossment of H.R. 7, the clerk shall 1. Await the disposition of H.R. 3408 and H.R. 3813. 2. Add the respective texts of H.R. 3408 and H.R. 3813 as passed by the House to H.R. 7, retaining the title and section designations as they appear in Rules Committee Print 112-14 to the extent possible. 3. Conform the title of H.R. 7 to reflect the addition of the text of H.R. 3408 or H.R. 3813 as passed by the House to the engrossment. 4. Assign appropriate designations to provisions within the engrossment. And 5. Conform provisions for short titles within the engrossment. B. Upon the addition of the text of H.R. 3408 or H.R. 3813 as passed by the House to the engrossment of H.R. 7, H.R. 3408 or H.R. 3813, as the case may be, shall be laid on the table. Section 7. The chair of each of the following committees is authorized, on behalf of the respective committee, to file a supplemental report to accompany any of the following measures. A. Natural Resources with respect to H.R. 3407, 3408, and 3410. B. Ways and Means with respect to H.R. 3864. And C. Oversight and Government Reform with respect to H.R. 3813.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 hour.
For the purpose of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, pending which I reserve the rest of my time I reserve such time as I may consume. During consideration of the resolution, all time yielded is for the purposes of debate only. Madam Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise or extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in support of this rule and the efforts made to address our aging national infrastructure and chronic unemployment. House Resolution 547 provides for a structured rule for consideration of H.R. 3408 for protecting investment in shale oil, the next generations of environmental energy and resource security, or PIONEERS Act. A structured rule for H.R. 3813, the Securing Annuities for Federal Employees, SAFE Act, and general debate for H.R. 7, the American Energy and Infrastructure Act. This rule makes 20 amendments in order for the PIONEERS Act. Of these, 13 are Democrat amendments and 3 are Republican, and then there are 3 bipartisan amendments. This rule also makes 3 amendments in order for the SAFE Act. However, over 80% of the amendments submitted to the Rules Committee are dealing with H.R. 7, so the bulk of the amendment debate will take place later this week. Finally, this rule sets the stage for a robust debate on H.R. 7, the American Energy and Infrastructure Act, the long-term surface transportation reauthorization. In order to gather innovative ideas and input into the reauthorization proposal, in addition to the regular subcommittee and full committee hearings held here in Washington, Transportation Infrastructure Chairman Mica and the committee conducted several bipartisan and in some cases even bicameral hearings at public forums around the country. In total, 14 field hearings were held from locations like Los Angeles and Chicago, and also to Millington, Tennessee, and Maitland, Florida. The previous transportation authorization, Safety Lou, was enacted in 2005, and it expired September 30th of in 2009. Since that time, surface transportation programs and activities have operated under a series of short-term extensions. The most recent of these extensions expires March 31st, 2012. The Transportation and Infrastructure Committee put together a long-term reauthorization of highway transit and highway safety programs that will provide much-needed certainty and stability to those charged with rebuilding our nation's infrastructure and all who depend on it for their safe travel. H.R. 7 authorizes approximately $260 billion over 5 years for highway transit, rail safety, and other programs, which is consistent with current funding levels. It provides 5 years of stability for states to undertake major infrastructure projects and provide lasting employment. It also allows states to spend their highway money on actual highway projects. By removing federal requirements that currently force states to spend highway money on non-highway activities, the American Energy and Infrastructure Act ensures that our nation's highways and bridges are repaired and properly maintained, and that federal dollars are spent on the most crucial infrastructure needs. As opposed to past transportation efforts, this bill stops the annual raid on general fund to bail out the Highway Trust Fund and is paid for by CBO scoring savings and revenues. Significant savings are generated by the SAFE Act, which increases federal employee pension contributions to 2.3%. It also increases pension contributions by members of Congress to 2.8%. Revenues also are generated by the Pioneers Act, which not only removes federal barriers that block production of our own energy, U.S. energy from U.S. energy resources, but also creates over 1 million new energy jobs. Finally, unlike last transportation bills, including those overseen by both Republicans and Democrats, H.R. 7 contains no earmarks. To put that in perspective, the previous transportation law contains over 6,300 earmarks. The American Energy and Infrastructure Act also significantly reforms transportation policy in this country. As families across the nation tighten their own belts during this difficult economic times, they are re-examining their budgets to ensure no penny is wasted or unnecessarily spent on unnecessarily or duplicative expenses. Because your pennies are placed into the Highway Trust Fund every time you fill up your car due to the federal gas tax, it is that same necessary spirit that the American Energy and Securities Act re-examines the dozens of programs paid for by the Highway Trust Fund to root out any duplication, waste, or inefficiency. Currently, over 100 federal service transportation programs. Many were added over the last 50 years since the interstate highway system was created in 1956 to expand the scope of the original programmatic goals of our transportation system. The American Energies and Infrastructure Jobs Act reforms surface transportation programs by consolidating or eliminating approximately 70 programs that are duplicative or do not serve a federal purpose. By eliminating or consolidating these cookie-cutter programs that the federal government is certainly known for, stamping out a program that supposedly fits Florida and Montana and Maine and every other state equally, and including the cities and counties within those communities, which is almost impossible to have one plan fits all. This eliminates many of those programs, gives them the flexibility to create programs on their own, similar to what the President just did by exempting many states from the No Child Left Behind. Why? Because the states did a better job than the cookie-cutter approach done by that particular program. By eliminating or consolidating these cookie-cutter programs, the American Energy and Infrastructure Jobs Act helps ensure taxpayer dollars go to high priority projects that have a direct connection to our economy. By eliminating requirements for states to spend highway funds on non-highway activities, H.R. 7 permits states to fund those activities in which they choose, but allows states also to fund the most crucial infrastructure needs first. The bill also strengthens safety programs and gives states more flexibility to develop innovative safety initiatives that save lives. In short, the bill seeks to return the focus of our highway funds to interstate commerce and safe travel, and allowing states to choose their own course of action. For those projects that are crucial for the safe and efficient movement of goods and people around our nation, this legislation streamlines their delivery process or construction time by cutting the average highway construction completion time in half, from 14 years to 7 years. The American Infrastructure and Energy Act cuts bureaucratic red tape by allowing federal agencies to review transportation projects concurrently, delegates project approval authority to the states, and establishes hard deadlines for federal agencies to make decisions on permits and project approvals. The bureaucracy inherent in the approval and delivery process has proven to be a real hurdle, delaying long overdue projects to improvements to highways, bridges, and other projects. H.R. 7 also expands the list of activities that qualify for categorical exclusions, an approval process that is faster and simpler than the standard process. While cutting the project review process time in half, we are also ensuring environmental protections, such as those under the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA. They remain in place while making infrastructure improvements in a much more effective manner. The American Energy and Infrastructure Act also reforms financing programs to increase private sector involvement in building infrastructure. For example, it funds the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, TIFIA program, for low-cost interest loans at $1 billion per year. It also incentivizes states to build upon the existing State Infrastructure Bank program by allowing states to seek out revenue-generating infrastructure projects that lack the capital to move from planning to pavement. As these pressing state and local infrastructure needs are met, taxpayer exposure for future projects will lessen as revenues generated by the State Infrastructure Bank funded projects will be recycled back into the Infrastructure Bank for future projects. And the American Energy and Infrastructure Act provides certainty to communities that infrastructure will be rebuilt and provides stability to those whose jobs depend on our commitment to rebuilding it. Given the current economy, it seeks to safeguard valuable taxpayer dollars by cutting Washington red tape and leveraging private sector dollars. It frees up states and local governments to make decisions that are in the best interest of their communities that they serve. It does all this without a single earmark or a single tax increase, and it's all paid for. Once again, Madam Speaker, I rise in support of this rule and the efforts made by the relevant committees to address the nation's infrastructure and chronic unemployment. I encourage my colleagues to vote yes on the rule, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Florida reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster, for yielding me the customary 30 minutes. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks, and I yield such time as I may consume.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, oh my goodness, I don't even know where to begin, but I first would like to publicly thank the reading clerk for his patience in slogging through the reading of this terribly complicated and confusing rule. I think the mere reading of this rule says it all, demonstrating how messed up this process is. Madam Speaker, Speaker Boehner used to be fond of criticizing bills by saying they wouldn't pass the straight-face test. Well, let me tell you, I'm having trouble keeping a straight face right now. Not when I look at this incredibly partisan, slapdash set of bills before us. Not when I look at the awful, convoluted process that got us here. Madam Speaker, this process is an absolute travesty. The Republican leadership took a 1,000-page bill, the most partisan transportation bill in congressional history, and made it worse. They took a bill that was written in secret and jammed through the Transportation Committee and inserted unrelated and controversial provisions like Keystone Pipeline, ANWR, offshore drilling, and cuts in federal pensions. Even worse, they changed the rules in the middle of the game, because yesterday morning, after everyone had submitted their amendments to the original single bill, Speaker Boehner decided to split it into 3 separate measures. And he said it was in the name of transparency. Transparency? Give me a break. It was more like the Valentine's Day massacre of transparency. You know a bill is bad when the Competitive Enterprise Institute, Taxpayers for Common Sense, and the Natural Resources Defense Council are all opposed to how it's structured. Talk about strange bedfellows. Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood, a former Republican congressman, called H.R. 7, and I quote, the most partisan transportation bill I have ever seen. And I further quote him. He said, it is the worst transportation bill I've ever seen during 35 years of public service. The chairman of the Transportation Committee calls this a bipartisan product. Madam Speaker, making Democratic amendments in order in and of itself and then defeating them doesn't make a bill bipartisan. Transportation bills, by their nature, have always been truly bipartisan, written together by the majority and minority, Republicans and Democrats. In the past, have not only worked in good faith on this bill, they have put their differences aside and did their jobs. I should know. I served in the Transportation Committee during a Republican-controlled House in my first term, and I served as a conferee to the 1998 reauthorization bill. Yet, H.R. 7 abandons years of good faith efforts by members of both parties to thoughtfully and responsibly craft a bipartisan transportation bill that reflects the priorities and vital importance of infrastructure investments across this country. H.R. 7 slashes investments in federal highways by $15.8 billion from current levels over the bill's duration. It does so at a time when our roads and bridges are crumbling before our eyes. This bill ignores that harsh reality. It guts transit funding by delinking dedicated federal funding from the Highway Trust Fund and lumping it in with a smorgasbord of other transportation accounts that will be forced to compete for annual appropriations. What's most egregious and irresponsible about this bill, worse than the hyper-partisanship, worse than the atrocious process, is that this bill will result in 550,000 job losses. We should be focused, Madam Speaker, on creating good jobs in manufacturing and construction, 2 sectors hardest hit with job losses, not kicking them while they're already down. And like so many other bills, Republicans couldn't let an opportunity pass to help their friends at Big Oil. Oil companies are making more money hand over fist to the tune of tens of billions of dollars in record profits every year. Now we're seeing gas prices rise again. Yet Republicans continue to provide $40 billion worth of taxpayer-funded subsidies to companies who don't need them and don't deserve them. Last night in the Rules Committee, I tried to end taxpayer subsidies to Big Oil. But instead of asking ExxonMobil, BP, Chevron, Shell, and other big oil companies to pay their fair share while prices at the pump rise, the Republicans doubled down for their corporate friends and blocked my amendments. I offered it 3 different ways last night, and all 3 ways were rejected, not even given the courtesy of consideration on this House floor. But I'll offer it again today if the Rules Committee meets. But I have no doubt the other side will continue what they usually do, stand with Big Oil, and will continue to block my amendment. Allowing more oil and gas drilling off our coast and opening up the treasured Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to drilling will do nothing to lower gas prices in the short term, let alone pay for this bill. At best, it will be years before any money would come from the new drilling areas. And let's not forget the Keystone provision that's jammed in here that would automatically deem, I use the word deem, the environmentally harmful pipeline be approved. Oh, and then there's the provision to force federal employees who are currently under a 2-year pay freeze to nearly triple their contributions to their federal retirement accounts. Republican leadership has once again found a way to take a swipe at federal employees, even in the surface transportation bill. This part is really confusing. The Republicans are using this attack on federal employees to pay for the highway bill, but they are also apparently, according to press reports, using the same revenue to pay for the payroll tax extension. Perhaps my friend from Florida, and I'm happy to yield to him, could explain to us how they expect to use the same pot of money to pay for two separate things. Well, maybe we'll get an answer later on in the debate. Madam Speaker, Democrats want a fully funded, common-sense transportation bill that puts people back to work. We want a bill that makes our roads and bridges safer, not more dangerous. We want a bill that is good for America. This is not that bill. This bill before us is nothing but red meat political propaganda at its worst. It simply makes no sense. It will not become law. We should scrap this bill and start over and do it the right way. That's the way we've always done it. We should do it in a bipartisan way, come together, and help get a really good transportation bill that will put people back to work. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In hearing what I heard in Rules Committee last night and here on the floor this morning, it reminds me that people that have been here a long time love cookie cutters. And so many of the people that are opposed to this bill are opposed to it because they like cookie cutters. They like to say that this program works here and there and everywhere, as opposed to giving flexibility to the states. Cookie cutters are used in education funding, they're used in Medicaid funding, they're used in this particular funding, transportation, and they're used to limit the flexibility of states who really know what their program is. It's far better for the District 5 in Central Florida MPO to put together a program, build it from the ground up, determine what their needs are and what the modes of transportation they would like to have, build that program, send it up to the state, the legislature passes, and it becomes law. But no, right now there are so many different little programs that you have to put money into that you cannot devise your own program. You have to live within the constraints of a federal government who believes in cookie cutters. And it's sad. So when you start talking about people who have been around 35 years and they've never seen a program like this, no, because they love cookie cutters. And they love it the way it is because it promotes the federal government making decisions for the states and local communities as opposed to the local communities being able to develop their own programs. And so in the end, these long time ago funding bills, let me tell you what it did to Florida. In Florida, at one point in time, back in the times that we're talking about, we got 69% of our money back, while states in other areas of the country, including the Northeast, got maybe two times that amount of money. So the money and the funding and the flexibility were all non-existent. Why? So if I were on the take, I would have liked to keep it the way it was. But when we began flattening it out and giving every state a chance and returning more monies back to the state, and with that return also allowing them to make their own choices on how they would fund their transportation projects and what kind of needs they have, and being able to, with flexibility from the federal government, provide for those needs for the local community, there are a lot of people say, I don't want to do it that way. Why? I love cookie cutters. I yield back. I know I've reserved the rest of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as may consume. I don't know what the gentleman is talking about. All I do know is that this bill underfunds our highway and transportation system. It guts mass transit. It's not good for any state in this country. We deserve a better bill. And also what I've learned is that all these new members that came to Washington say they want a more open process or give us one of the most convoluted processes I think I've ever witnessed on this floor. At this time, it's my privilege to yield as much time as she may consume to the gentlewoman from New York, the ranking member of the Rules Committee, Ms. Slaughter.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized for as much time as she may consume.
Good morning, Madam Speaker, or good afternoon. And I thank the gentleman very much for yielding. Madam Speaker, we stand here today considering a rule that is a blatant manipulation of the legislative process, which we have been pretty proud of, frankly, since the beginning of time here. Process is very important in legislative business. And we have, while it may seem like cookie cutter, but we all still revere Thomas Jefferson and his manual. That's just the way we are, I guess. But breaking with long-standing bipartisan tradition for the consideration of surface transportation bills, today's rule throws all notions of bipartisanship and transparency out the window. As you have heard, it is the first transportation bill since Eisenhower was president that was not bipartisan. And it moves toward a transportation bill that has been widely condemned on both sides of the aisle and by almost everybody who knows about it in the United States. Now, as you can see on this poster beside me, the Grand Ole Pretzels rating system tracks the legislative contortions that are being done by the Republican leadership as they pursue a hyper-partisan agenda. We launched this system to answer the calls of the American people. What in the world is going on there? No matter which party is in power, the American people demand a fair shot, not a rigged game. The legislative acrobatics being done by the majority are really quite remarkable. I don't know anybody else on earth who could have even thought of it. No matter what has happened here, this stunt work began late last week, as Mr. McGovern pointed out, when we were fully expecting to come in on Monday and deal with a 1,000-page transportation infrastructure bill. The legislation that we knew already, because we'd heard so many complaints about it, was cobbled together into a Frankenstein's monster. It was made up of completely, believe me, completely unrelated and most times unvetted provisions that addressed almost every issue under the sun. Secretary of Transportation, as we all know, who is our good friend, deplores this bill. He would like to see this bill fail. However, before the Rules Committee convened last night, and that's not the first time this year, we were given the last-minute notice that Frankenstein's monster was going to be disassembled and broken into 3 separate bills. This last-minute change would allow the majority to limit the number of germane amendments, 300 were filed, and rule out of order common-sense attempts by Democrats to make some special interests, such as big oil, and Mr. McGovern's fought this for years, pay their fair share instead of receiving billions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies. After forcing through these 3 bills, the majority plans to direct the clerk of the House to stitch it back together. So the whole purpose of it is to try a sleight of hand, what shell game are we playing here? That's what we're up to, I'm afraid. So that gives the Senate a stitched-together bill, which we had cut into 3. I don't want anybody to miss this point. And they can take it or leave it, or I hope have a better bill than this. That's what we're hoping for. But for inventing a way to pass as many Republican amendments as possible and block as many Democrat amendments as possible while still sewing this monster back again, I want to award the majority for Grand Ole Pretzels the coveted quadruple contortion. The majority has truly achieved the remarkable. Unfortunately, their acrobatic achievements come at great cost to the House, and by pursuing a partisan agenda over transparency and bipartisanship, the majority moves forward alone against the wishes of their colleagues and the American people. And I certainly should mention that the President has said this bill will be vetoed by him. He again calls for us to work in a bipartisan manner, not to be throwing more people out of work, but to create jobs with an infrastructure bill which is time-honored and may be as cookie-cutter as it gets, but by George, it works.